The Honourable Chester Burrows.
Mr Speaker, it gives me quite a lot of pleasure to stand up and speak to this bill because it emanates from a church that I was born and raised in, the Associated Churches of Christ within New Zealand. And in fact, I note that the initial proponent of the bill, Mr Steve Bagent from Nelson, was a member of the Church of Christ at Annesbrook, which was the church that I attended as a young fella. In fact, it was in his mother's garden as a 4-year-old that I met my future wife, then aged 2. She doesn't remember. But it is interesting. No, I didn't ask her out on that occasion. But it is interesting to see the impact of, or to reflect on the impact of churches across New Zealand in those days, which was the 50s and 60s, and where it is today. But and this is a church, they called it a brotherhood in those days. An association, I suppose, is the more polite term these days. They're a smaller group. They're not recognised as, I guess, as some of the bigger churches that we have within our community. But in fact, they had a big impact on particularly rural New Zealand in those days. They emanated in New Zealand from the Nelson region, and a number of churches sprung up around there. Their raison d'etre was evangelism, but also to seek unity across the churches, and that was the whole reason why they stepped out of the parent church that they came from, was actually to understand that there was a need for society to see all Christians as one, rather as peddling a particular doctrine that seemed to be more divisive than bringing people together. And they were one of the 5 negotiating churches towards church unity in the 1970s. And there was a high lay involvement within that church, and a lot of us as kids can remember, me particularly, being in the back of a little Morris Minor as it struggled over the Tākaka Hill to go and deliver the message in places like Bainham and Tākaka, or driving down to the coast from Stoke and Nelson to deliver a couple of sermons on a Sunday before coming back, and our parents getting on with work the next day. And there's a few connections too within the House. My cousins, the Honourable Annette King and the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, their forebears were instrumental in starting congregations at Spring Grove and in Richmond. And those churches too carry on, they exist today and continue with some strength. And as noted in the report that comes back from the committee, there are others too who have come up through that church and made a huge contribution to society. I think of Sir Garfield Todd, who emanated again from this church and went on to become the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia as it was back then, prior to the Smith regime. And the Todd family is one of the families that have been involved again within these congregations over generations. And another is Fred Hollows, who trained in the ministry in Dunedin at Glenleith before he embarked on his ways in respect of helping those with eye problems that became absolutely noted. The church also worked in other countries, and just noting the connection with Southern Rhodesia again, it started a mission school at a place called Dodaya, and that was where a number of our members who were educators and also men of the cloth went to work in the mission fields over there. I guess one person we'd like to walk away from is Robert Mugabe, who was a student at that school, funnily enough. I think he's shaken the dust off his sandals because he doesn't seem to be adhering to the principles of the Associated Churches of Christ just now. But it is a church that over the years has continued to give an awful lot to the communities in which it served, and around the country there are about 40 different congregations. There was one, for instance, at Lower Hutt, and former Labour member for that area, Neville Young, was a member of that congregation at Nainai. And I remember as a young guy listening to the men and women in the church who would bring their thoughts before the congregation. It wasn't so much pastorally led as membership led, and so each of those men and women were given the opportunity to stand up and speak, to lead lessons, to teach and to pray, and work for their communities. It was very much, and still remains very much, a church which tends to put its money where its mouth is, and that's what lies behind this bill. The fact is that the bill has tied up a lot of the church's assets in a way that it can't be used for their principal goal, which is ministry. And in effect, what this church is saying is we want to free ourselves of those assets and use that money towards the ministry to which we feel that we've been called. It's sad to note that maybe Christian churches haven't been their best advocates around the country, maybe around the world, for some time now. But it is great to be able to sit back and to look at a group of people who do feel a sense of vocation, we would call it in secular terms. Others would call it a calling, who may adhere to a faith, to get involved within their communities. And no doubt every one of the members who is sitting in this chamber today actually came here for a reason. Many felt that they came here because they wanted to make a contribution, and where that sense of, or that will of wanting to make that contribution comes from, largely, and Christians are overrepresented within this chamber as a sliver or a slice of the general population of the country. I think it's important to note that these sense of values that drives us on, whether or not we pin it to a particular religion or particular creed, nevertheless is an important one. People who give of themselves in community service and do so from a sense of service and public service actually hold the thread of our communities together. And that is why when we go into the various NGOs or those community groups that we visit, and on a regular basis, we see people turn up time and time and time again. We might see the same faces at 5 or 6 organisations we might visit within our electorates on a weekly basis, and these people are giving because not only do they see the need, but they hear a call, or they feel a sense of call towards contributing to their communities in that way. And I think back, as I do, to a number of the personalities that I saw working and operating within their churches and within their communities as part of this particular church. I do have a sense of gratitude for where those people have taken my family and me particularly, or personally, on a walk towards exactly where we find ourselves today, and each of us in the house does, as I've just reflected. The fact is that those sense of values, as soon as you get a few years on you, you tend not to notice around the community and the subsequent generations, but nevertheless it is there. And we have to then quiz ourselves and wonder about how well we are at communicating that sense of call or that sense of vocation that led us here, or leads us to contribute to our communities in the way that we do. Because if it isn't being passed on from generation to generation or neighbour to neighbour, we have to ask, why not? And so I commend this bill to the House, and I acknowledge the fact that here is a group of people who recognise that they are asset rich and need to do something about it. They realise that they didn't belong to that particular organisation to acquire assets or to acquire land and to build edifices to some faith that is actually meaningless outside of those edify. But actually, they joined a particular movement so that they could turn it on for the people who had needs within their community and reflect the faith that they had taken on for themselves. Often we scoff at people who do things from a sense of faith. Often we find people laughing behind their hands at those who might believe in something as simple as a Christian faith. In actual fact, the people who adhere to this church and all those other churches do so from a sense of what we would call in a secular way goodwill or public interest. But we know what drives us, and we are here or I'm here today in this house to endorse that sense of call and that sense of worth in a community. I commend the bill to the House.